This is a special edition of Father Cory's Book Club, and today I'm presenting the first in a series on Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, originally published in 1951. Kind of, but we'll get into that. Ray Bradbury is known for his work in science fiction and in what we would call dystopia. We'll talk a little bit about what dystopia is as we set up kind of the background for Fahrenheit 451. Fahrenheit 451 is considered to be a dystopian novel, but as we will see, it has a very different character from most other entries in the genre, something that sets it apart and I think gives it an enduring significance. Fahrenheit 451 is an incredibly important book. I would argue it's one of the most important works of fiction of the 20th century. It's a very significant book, I'll say, for me personally. I first discovered it in high school. It was on the reading list for an academic competition team that I was on, where we had to read certain books and then be able to answer questions about them up on stage in front of people. This is what I did instead of playing sports, because if you look, I'm obviously a professional athlete. But Fahrenheit 451 I first encountered, as I say, in high school. I was about a sophomore in high school. And I read it then, and I thought it was an interesting book. But it's a book I returned to over the years, and every time I've read it, I've got something else out of it. Every time I've read it, I've found kind of a deeper dimension to it. And it's one that, especially as I've, in my own life, kind of become, a little bit better versed intellectually in matters of philosophy and in matters of theology, in things concerning the life of the mind, I've seen kind of a deeper significance to this book than I think would have been there in my initial impressions of it. I think it's a very significant book. Also, in the history of this project, this thing that we call Father Cory's Book Club, I started the book club last spring. It was about a year ago. About a year ago in early May or maybe late April of last year. I don't recall exactly. But I started publishing book reviews in the Bulletin here at St. Vincent's Parish. And my point in doing that was to share books that, again, I thought were important, I thought were good for Catholics to read, to kind of assist in our kind of intellectual formation, that being such an important part of really just being a good person, being a well-rounded person, informing the life of the mind. Fahrenheit 451 doesn't just do that, it's also a defense of why those kinds of things are important. And so we'll get into that as we go. But again, significant in the history of this project, the very limited history of this very modest project of my book club. This was the fourth book that I published a review of, and it was the one I got the most feedback on. I had about a dozen people contact me in some way or another. Some of them just came up to me after Mass. Some of them emailed me, thanking me for reviewing Fahrenheit 451. It was people who had never read it before, who, thanks to my review, then purchased it, read it, and got a lot out of it because of the, kind of what I had offered as sort of the significance of the book. There was one woman I remember even told me that she cut out my review, made copies of it, and sent it to her children and grandchildren because she thought it maybe would help to influence them to think about matters of faith a little bit more deeply that they left behind, which is very interesting because it isn't a particularly religious book. It doesn't really say one way or the other anything about religion or spirituality. It doesn't say approve it or disapprove of it. And Bradbury himself, if I'm not mistaken, and if I am mistaken, please correct me. And if I need to offer correction to myself, I'll do it in subsequent videos. But Ray Bradbury himself was not a terribly religious person. But a lot of what he has to say about the importance of the life of the mind is going to be very important for us as people of faith. That we work on the principle, this comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, that grace builds upon nature. So that if we want to know God, if we want to know God and to understand revelation, that we have to begin with the foundation. We have to begin with what nature has given us, and let then grace build upon it. That our kind of our basic nature as rational beings is the foundation upon which we then can live the life of grace. And so it's important that we form the mind, because one of the the chief sort of demands of faith is to know. What is it? The classic Baltimore Catechism answer, why did God make me? To know him, to love him, to serve him, and to be happy with him in the next life. So to know is very important, and so the life of the mind is very important. And that's why Fahrenheit 451 is very important, because it serves as a bit of a cautionary tale against the sort of assault on the life of the mind. So as you can tell, this is a book I'm plenty excited about. As you can see, I have lots and lots of notes on it. These are older notes from a few years ago when I first presented the talks that I'm going to be giving now as part of a lecture at Belmont Abbey to the faculty there. But anyway, so let's dive right in. What we're going to be doing over the next few weeks as I unfold this, tonight I'm just going to kind of talk about, again, why the book is important. I've been standing here for 5 minutes saying that it is important. I'm going to talk about why it's important, what is the premise of the book, and a little bit about what led Ray Bradbury to write it, and then get into where does it take its place among that sort of subgenre of fiction that we call dystopia. Is it dystopia, and kind of how does it relate to other works that we might call dystopian? And then I'll talk a little bit about tonight, again, how does this relate to the life of the mind, kind of what we would call the enterprise of the liberal arts, before going into a brief synopsis of the plot and some people to kind of look out for as we go along, some characters to pay attention to, and kind of their nature. In the subsequent weeks, I'll actually just go into each chapter of the book. It has 3 chapters. It's actually a very brief book. I once read it on a flight from Detroit to Charlotte. I think I read almost the whole thing. Got on the plane, took my seat, started reading, and was most of the way done with it by the time we landed. So it can be read in an afternoon, possibly 2 or 3 afternoons if you're either pressed for time or don't read so quickly. But again, very kind of quick read, but not a light one, because again, there's a lot going on in this book. I'll go through each chapter, kind of longish chapters relative to the length of the book, because there's 3 of them. I'll go through each chapter kind of individually, and then I'll top it off by talking about meanings and observations that we might make, and some of the patterns that you will see in terms of character interactions, in terms of the symbolism in the story. So, without further ado, what is Fahrenheit 451 about? What is the premise of the book? It's a book about burning books. It's a book about a future where books have been banned by the government, and firemen don't put out fires, because by this point, all the structures, the technology has evolved such that buildings and all buildings, houses and things are all fireproof. So firemen putting out fires is not really necessary. And so firemen have a task of going around and burning books, and burning the houses where the books are kept, because people who keep books are seen as kind of a threat to society. And so this, this sounds kind of like a very bleak sort of future, which is what then makes it dystopia. So that word dystopia comes from we talk about utopia. Utopia would be kind of the perfect world, the ideal world. Dystopia is meant to be kind of the ironic sort of opposite of that. That if we imagine a utopia as being this perfect world, dystopia is a world that is very broken, where the course of history has kind of gone off the rails somehow, and we've been led on to kind of a dangerous trajectory. Things that come to mind in this genre, 1984 by George Orwell, perhaps the one of the most enduring examples of that. More recently, we've had some entries into the genre several years ago, quite a while ago actually, not quite as recently as I would have thought. The graphic novel that then got turned into the movie, V for Vendetta. We also have things like, so 1984, Animal Farm is another kind of entry into the genre, not quite as much. It's meant to be more of a critique of different political systems. V for Vendetta. More recently, things like The Handmaid's Tale, which has been out for a while, but it's recently come to prominence. The Hunger Games, Divergent. There were several kind of series of young adult / teen dystopian novels that got turned into a lot of movies, which involved either Jennifer Lawrence or Shailene Woodley. I have a hard time telling the difference. I'm sure they're both wonderful people, but I've not watched a lot of those movies. I think I've seen the first Hunger Games movie. Those were really big several years ago, and in some ways they're very interesting entries to the genre. Me personally, not really my taste. I don't find them quite as compelling as something like Fahrenheit 451. But all of these stories, I bring them up because they're all meant to convey that sort of reality where things have gone very badly somewhere along the line. Most of them involve some kind of tyranny. Most of them involve some kind of dictatorial government. Of course, 1984, Big Brother enters into our vernacular now as this, as the idea, of the government kind of overseeing our every move and kind of controlling everything. That's where that idea comes from, is in Orwell's 1984. Big Brother is the government, basically. Fahrenheit 451 is very different from dystopian literature in that there isn't really government tyranny. Now, how can I say that when I say this is a book about a future where the government, agents of the government, the firemen, go around burning books? It sounds like it's a book about censorship. To quote Neil Gaiman, who wrote a very good foreword to this edition, this is the 60th anniversary edition that came out several years ago. It's hard to believe it's been quite that long, but Neil Gaiman, the noted British sci-fi author, sci-fi fantasy, it's not really fair to box him in just one genre. He's written quite a lot, written a lot of very good stuff. But he says in his introduction, if someone tells you what a story is about, they are probably right. If they tell you that is all the story is about, they are very definitely wrong. So if someone tells you that Fahrenheit 451 is a book about burning books, they're right. If someone tells you that it's a book about censorship, they're right. But if they tell you that that's all that it's about, then they are very definitely wrong. And Ray Bradbury himself said it wasn't just about censorship. There's something very different going on in Fahrenheit 451 in that the people welcome the books being censored. They welcome that the firemen come and burn the books. You've got a few people who are kind of the outliers that are keeping the books. But by and large, the people don't mind that there is censorship, that there is this, what we would think of as a manifestation of tyranny. Because as we will see, the central point of Fahrenheit 451 is not that the government has censored all the books, that the government is burning all the books, and that is tyranny, but the real tyranny is an interior one. The real tyranny is that the mind has become closed. Because how he outlines, how Ray Bradbury outlines that this has happened, is that people become gradually more offended by more and more things, that you have to take out a page here and a page there so as not to offend this group or to offend that little group. And by the time everyone has gotten done being offended by all the contents of your book, there's nothing left. There's just an empty cover with no pages in it. And this is something he will go on to lament as the backstory is sort of laid within the novel. So the tyranny that is usually kind of an essential characteristic of dystopia, that there is some kind of tyrannical force that has given us to the straits that we find ourselves in when we read the story, is not actually external to the people who are undergoing the tyranny. It's interior to them. It's the closing of the mind. That it is the influence of again, a sort of culture of being offended by everything, combined with a very individualistic sense brought on by kind of an overuse of technology, brought on by an overdependence upon virtual communication and a lack of sort of personal relationship between people, such that people become exceedingly objectified. And people begin to lose the ability to relate to one another, and only to sort of relate to one another virtually through certain kind of mediation, the mediation of technology, and that becomes almost a substitute for reality. And anything that could be introduced that could kind of take the place of that, or to upset the relationship people have then with with that sort of thing is seen as a threat. So what it is that ideas become frightening to people. Ideas become scary, and so people are happy to be delivered from the burden of having to think about anything. It sounds kind of scary because it sounds alarmingly familiar. Another characteristic of dystopia that Fahrenheit 451 actually has, if dystopia is sort of conditioned on there being tyranny, that things have gone badly because there is some kind of tyranny, or things went badly and that led to tyranny happening. I think, for example, of V for Vendetta, the party that takes over, the way that they're able to do that is that they have kind of a false flag operation. They employ a biological weapon to infect the populace, and then the party itself actually is paying for the development of the treatment for this biological agent. They do that, the dictator seizes power, and then he controls everybody. He uses that as kind of a stunt to get into power, and to gain sort of popularity. Whereas, so again, all dystopia seems to have that kind of, at the very least, in the background. And with Fahrenheit 451, government tyranny is very much in the background, very far removed. The actual tyranny is that of the mind, and the closing of the mind. Fahrenheit 451 also, though, has very strongly the kind of counterpoint to the one who is sort of enslaving everything, and that's the liberator figure. That in just about every dystopian story, there is someone who is either a revolutionary himself, who does the job of throwing off the tyranny, or there is someone who inspires the common people to rise up. In 1984, the main character, whose name escapes me at the moment, he is the one who kind of has this awakening and rises up. V for Vendetta, it's V, but it's also his sort of companion Evie, whom he's taken under his wing. It isn't just him, and in the end, really, he will inspire her to be the one who actually causes the revolution. I should step aside here really quickly and say a couple of things. First off, there are going to be a lot of spoilers in everything we're talking about. As I talk about other works, as I just told you, I just kind of spoiled the end of the movie V for Vendetta. I know you're supposed to put spoiler alerts at the beginning. There's going to be plenty of spoilers of Fahrenheit 451. If you've not read it yet, I would suggest that you, before you watch the other videos in this series as they come out, read the book so that I'm not just giving it away. I'm not going to be reading it, partly because of copyright issues, and partly because that's not the point of this. The point of it is some analysis. But so that my analysis doesn't spoil the kind of dramatic tension for you, read the book before you go on watching the rest of the videos. I don't think I have given away too much tonight in what I'm talking about. Another thing I will say is that the works that I am talking about, with the exception of Divergent and Hunger Games, which are geared for a younger audience, are geared for a little bit older of an audience, and so reader and viewer discretion is advised. Some of these books have some strong language. Some of these books, when they get made into movies, have some violence to them. I will tell you, Fahrenheit 451, the chief violence that it has as a movie came out in the 60s, film adaptation by legendary director Francois Truffaut, and legendary German film actor Oskar Werner. I will say that the chief violence that it does is not actually in terms of on-screen violence. It's more the violence it does to the idea of filmmaking, because it is a delightfully terrible movie. I will definitely throw in some notes about that, because that will actually become important to some of what we're talking about as we go into the characters, because the movie is not very good. It is enjoyable in that it's a sort of charmingly bad 60s sci-fi movie. But it does sort of unlock for us one of the key kind of character interactions that you see in the book, but I'll say it's something that I wasn't really aware of about the book until I read the movie. Don't want to give that away. We'll go into that later on. But in any event, dystopia has a tyrannical figure, some kind of force of enslavement of the populace, and dystopia then has as a counterpoint to that the liberating figure. The liberator in Fahrenheit 451 is a fireman, a man who burns books, by the name of Guy Montag. And Montag will, in a certain sense, be the liberator because he first must liberate himself. And I believe, in my reading of Fahrenheit 451, Montag has always kind of been a free man. And I mean that in the classical sense, in that he is a man who is free to think, and thus free to pursue the liberal arts, but the liberal arts then make the man who practices them free. That just as we talk about kind of virtue having a sort of cyclical nature, if you act virtuously, your force of will for virtue will be strengthened, and that will enable you to do more virtuous things, which will then make you more virtuous, and so on. The liberal arts are like that. That if we practice the liberal arts, we will be more free, and that freedom will enable us to practice the liberal arts, which will make us more free, and so on. I think Montag, from the very first sentence of the book, is a free man. I think he is a contemplative, and I think his sort of revolution is not so much in changing himself, it's more in awakening to where he's always been, who he's always been, as this kind of contemplative and this kind of thinker. And that's awakened for him by the events of the story, but also by some of the people he encounters. It's something that always fascinates me in fiction, and I think good fiction does this. Like, the characteristic of good fiction is the psychology of the characters, but also their sort of interactions. What are two characters doing anytime they pair up? Anytime you see Montag and his wife, what's going on between them, and what does that tell us about life? What is that, how does that move the story? But also, how does it sort of underline the lesson of the story? How does it teach us? When Montag gets together, we'll meet Clarice. Clarice is a very important character. What is happening when Montag talks to her? What's happening when Montag talks to his captain? What's happening when Montag talks to the old professor who's hiding away in his house? What are these things? What are the dynamics between these people? And what does it have to teach us? This is also, incidentally, I think, a useful way of reading Scripture, particularly reading the Gospels. When Jesus gets together with this person or that person, or when these two people are interacting, what's going on between them? And what does that have to teach us? So in any event, we've talked a little bit about how Fahrenheit 451, again, part of this genre of dystopia, representing kind of a not-so-great trajectory for the future. I want to go back a little bit now and talk about, why did Ray Bradbury write Fahrenheit 451? What was his impetus for it? So I said the book was written, or rather was published, in 1950. That is true in a way, but there were several kind of antecedent works that went into the production of Fahrenheit 451. There were several short stories that Ray Bradbury wrote. You can actually buy a volume of them. It's called A Pleasure to Burn. I'll include a link to information on that in the description of this video, which is actually the first line of the book is, "It was a pleasure to burn." And so A Pleasure to Burn is the short stories that kind of formed the basis then of Fahrenheit 451. And they're based on things that Ray Bradbury kind of observed about life as it was starting to be in the early 20th century, really the kind of the mid-20th century rather, in the United States. Incidents he would observe, things that would get him thinking, and he would come home and kind of write a short story about it. One of these is called The Pedestrian. And it's about a man who gets arrested for walking down the street because in the future, what he's kind of predicting, the trend that he is thinking will continue, is that walking down the street, which we don't consider to be anything problematic. As I make this video, Father Voidus is actually out for a walk right now. At least I think he is. He hasn't poked his head back into this room to make faces at me and try to throw me off, so I'm assuming he's still out on his walk. But we don't think walking down the street is unusual. We don't think walking down the street we certainly don't think it's sort of antisocial behavior. But in Ray Bradbury's story, The Pedestrian, a man goes walking down the street and gets arrested for it because that's thought of as very strange. He talks, that will form the basis then of something that is said in Fahrenheit 451, how, in the future, walking down the street, sitting out on the porch, and doing nothing at all, these are considered odd behaviors. This is something I think particularly salient for us here in 2020, as we've been going through the coronavirus pandemic and the stay-at-home orders and things like that. As I drive through my neighborhood in the evenings now, as we go over to hear confessions or otherwise go out in the evening, all the people that I see out, people I see out for walks, the children playing in the cul-de-sac, and people just kind of sitting on their porches and not doing anything at all. A year or two ago, you never would have thought that that would become something unusual. Because a year or two ago, that people went for walks, but it wasn't like the whole neighborhood was out, kind of enjoying the outdoors. And that's actually kind of where we've gotten to, is that sort of thing. Again, I don't think we're to the point of getting arrested because walking is an antisocial behavior, but it is interesting to see how we're cooped up all day inside during the lockdown, on our computers and our phones and stuff. And eventually, I think if you're like me, you reach sort of full saturation. You gotta go do something else. You gotta go for a walk. You gotta get out in the outdoors. You get tired of breathing the processed air conditioned air. You get tired of kind of living in the future, and you want to go live like it's 1990 or 1980 or 1950. And just go sit outside or walk around outside and not really do anything at all. That was one of the things that led to the writing of Fahrenheit 451. There's another story that is very important, again, to that side of it, that side of what is the culture looking like. One of the things, going back to talking about Neil Gaiman writing the foreword for this edition, and I encourage you, if you have the 60th anniversary edition, to read that foreword. Normally, big liberal arts guy, I don't advocate reading anything but the text itself. I was very angered one time to get this medieval... it was the medieval diary of a Spanish woman of some wealth, had the money to kind of travel in the Middle Ages, went to the Holy Land and wrote a diary of her experiences in the Holy Land, and especially her experiences of the Easter liturgies around Jerusalem. The book was 190 pages, of which 65 was the actual text. The rest was commentary, and I was just appalled at having to carry around that much extra paper that I, would probably read eventually, but for the most part, I was more concerned with the text. But I do encourage you, this is one of the rare exceptions I'll make, read Neil Gaiman's foreword to this. But one of the things he talks about he talks about the stories that go into the composition of Fahrenheit 451. He talks about, the things that Ray Bradbury's observing. And he talks about, kind of what is speculative fiction. And one of the things that makes for good speculative fiction is, and especially when you're writing dystopia, and you're writing about, kind of a critique of where things are headed, when you basically take the premise of, if this continues to happen, then things will look like this. And he says this is what Fahrenheit 451 is. If the culture continues to look like it did in the late 40s, when Ray Bradbury is writing all these things and having all these thoughts and eventually producing Fahrenheit 451, if things then continue to go how they are, what you wind up with is the world of Fahrenheit 451, which is set a little bit, kind of around our own time, really. And one of the things, so going back to it then, one of the stories that Bradbury wrote, or one of the, I don't remember if this was actually a story. It's a story he tells. I don't know that he wrote a short story about it, but it is a thought that influenced him very profoundly and led him to, again, kind of build in certain cultural critiques in Fahrenheit 451. He said he was out for a walk one night, that, notorious antisocial behavior, and he sees a couple walking down the opposite side of the street, and the woman is listening to a little transistor radio. So this happened about 1948, 1949, the first kind of commercially produced portable transistor radio. Came out in 1948. It was a very small package. If you can find them now, they're collector's items. They're worth tons of money, even though by today's technological standards, we can take the same kind of circuitry and make it like that big. But they are, they were just a marvel at the time, because previous to that, radios were, large devices with vacuum tubes in them. Now you could carry your radio around. It could work on battery power. So this woman's walking down the street, totally oblivious to her partner that she's walking with. She's got her little earbud in. She's listening to the radio, oblivious to him, and almost gets hit by a car because she's oblivious to everything going on around her. This is actually one of the reasons I don't listen to music or anything when I'm out walking around. I don't want to sort of dilute my situational awareness. I also try not to check my phone either when I go for walks. Situational awareness is very important. Safety tip, you get a little more than you bargained for in this video. You get some pedestrian safety tips. But there again, that made an impression on Bradbury, to see that this woman was cut off from the person that she was with. Somebody she obviously, cared enough about to take a walk with, cut off from this person, and so cut off from what's around her, she almost gets hit by a car. And he looks at that and says, if this continues, what is the world going to look like? And this leads then to one of the principal kind of thoughts in Fahrenheit 451, that it'll be a world where technology has kind of individualized people so utterly that they're oblivious to the people around them, they're oblivious to their surroundings. All they can really focus on is themselves. They kind of wall off and turn in on themselves. There is a story that it's in the volume A Pleasure to Burn, and it formed the basis for this novel. It's called The Fireman. It's about a fireman that burns books, and that's where basically got developed into Fahrenheit 451. The story of the composition of the novel is actually quite interesting. You think now, if you want to write a novel now, and if you've got a good idea, I encourage you, go write a novel. If you've got a bad idea, think about it a little bit more and then turn it into a good idea and then write a novel. Or write a not too good novel and then go back and edit it, because a lot of times bad novels get good in editing. I know this, having written a couple of bad novels that I've never edited. I assume that is how that works. My friends who have successfully written novels can probably tell me differently if I'm wrong or affirm what I'm saying is right. But we think of it, if I wanted to tonight, after I get done making this video, I want to write a novel, I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to sit and I'll probably take a few, scrawled notes that you can't even read. And I'll open my computer up and I'll start typing a story. And then when I'm done with draft after draft after draft, or done with this chapter and that chapter, I can print them out and I can hand them off to somebody. I can email them to somebody. I can put them on Dropbox or Google, whatever. And other people can review things for me. Bradbury didn't have that luxury because he's writing this in the late 40s. He had to use a sort of rental typewriter. He lived in San Francisco, and he would go to the University of California and go to the basement of one of the libraries. And he said that he literally nickel and dimed his way to a novel. He would feed coins into this typewriter, and you got, I think for 25 cents, you got like an hour of typewriter use. And so he would type and type and type and type, and then it would lock up and he'd have to put another quarter in and just keep going. And he said, that is how Fahrenheit 451 was produced. So interesting to think about that, and to think about, kind of where we've come technologically, which is part of the thrust of the book. I think speaking of which, I think that leads us to a question that will probably be of some concern to us. Are we saying that technology is a bad thing? Because it would seem like it. It would seem like the message of this book is books are really good and technology is bad, and technology makes us not want to read books. So we should stop using technology so that we don't become, self-centered people who never read books. That's not really what he's saying. I think Bradbury himself, not only in the message of the book, but in subsequent things that he wrote and said, he would say, technology is not bad. We just can't allow it to possess us. And that's a very Christian message, I think. Possessions are not bad, but we can't let our possessions possess us. That we have to see things, for their proper goodness, their proper ordering. Not to be possessed by our possessions, not to be used by our things, basically. But to sort of rise above and to think about things in their proper perspective. So I don't think that Bradbury is advocating that we become, neo-Luddites and live in a cabin in the woods off the grid. But what he's saying is we do have to be very careful that we don't let technology dehumanize us, which is again, a recurring theme in a lot of literature, in a lot of films and things that have come out even in the last several years. And that's why I think it's appropriate, and Neil Gaiman continually describes this book as a cautionary tale. In his foreword, he keeps talking about it like that, and I think that's what it's cautioning against. Not that technology is evil and is going to destroy us. Technology is neutral. Technology is a tool. Technology can be used for great good. It can be used, say, to make videos like this one, assuming that, that's at least moderately good. The videos that Father Voitis those videos are much better. We can use it to stream mass because we can't be together because of the stay-at-home orders and things. We can use technology to get in touch quickly, maybe in an emergency situation or things like that. Technology can be a very good thing. It can also be a very bad thing. And we hear the stories of how technology has, over dependence upon it, or using kind of the wrong kinds of materials can really hurt people. And so just like anything else, it's morally neutral. It is a tool, and we have to use it sort of appropriately. So again, the message is not technology is bad, books are good. The message is rather that we have to kind of put everything into its proper place and to give it sort of, I would argue, sort of its proper reverence. Saint Benedict, in his rule for monks, has a very interesting way of looking at this, and I bring this up because in these notes, which are a few years old now from that Belmont Abbey talk, I brought this in there because I had to tie in how does Fahrenheit 451 relate to discussion of the liberal arts and in that Benedictine context. Chapter 31 of the Rule of Benedict talks about how the goods of the chapter, the goods of the kind of monastic sort of council, are to be treated with the same reverence as the instruments of the altar. So what Benedict is saying is not that the chalice that's used on the altar should be used for profane purposes, but rather that even just sort of the common ordinary things, the ordinary tools that they would use for their work, those things are to be treated with reverence as a gift from God. And obviously in the monastic context, this becomes especially important because, of course, monks live a life of poverty. They don't own anything of their own. They own it all in common. And so there's a reverence paid to it because it is a gift from God. It's sort of a free gift given to you through the community. Because anything you want or need, you have to go to the abbot and get his leave to sort of use those goods. So I think that idea of giving the goods their proper reverence. So perhaps something for us to think about in the context then with Fahrenheit 451, our technology can be good, but we have to give it reverence, and reverence means not overusing it. I believe it was G.K. Chesterton that said that that the proper way to show reverence to things like beer and wine is to not to drink too much of them. Again, to kind of respect them and to respect the goodness of them, but not to overdo it to the point that we can't. So, points to ponder as far as that goes. So that kind of, I think, sets up for us Fahrenheit 451, its premise, its kind of basic plot. Well, having gone to the plot, I'm going to that in a second. It sets up for us the premise of it, kind of where does it fit in dystopia? What did Ray Bradbury kind of mean by writing it? Again, he means it as a cautionary tale, that ultimately we have to be very careful not to become possessed by our possessions, not to become sort of slaves of our technology. Not that technology is evil, but that technology should be kind of used properly. I give a brief here now synopsis. Again, as I said, the story takes place in 3 parts, 3 chapters. The first one is called The Hearth and the Salamander. The salamander referring to, there's a medieval legend that the salamander was born in flames. And so in Fahrenheit 451, the firemen, one of their emblems, is a salamander that they wear down their sleeve. This is where we meet Montag. This is where we see the work of the firemen. This is where we see Montag kind of doubting his world. Like even before he's really had experiences that kind of jar him awake, he's starting to doubt. The cracks are there, like I say, on the very first page. Montag is a thinker from the very first page. He's doubting his profession. He's doubting his marriage. And we will get more into detail in that as we meet his wife in this chapter. He struggles because, this is very early on in the book. They get a call for a fire. There's an old house, or get a call not for a fire, but to start a fire, backwards from how firemen tend to work. They get a call that an old house is full of books, and they burn a house with all these books in it, but the old woman who lives there refuses to budge. And this sort of traumatizes Montag, and it's kind of the thing that begins to, if those cracks are starting to form, this is really what really gets him to question. We find out that Montag is not only a thinker and a contemplative, Montag is hiding books himself. In this chapter as well, we will meet his boss, Captain Beatty. The next chapter is called The Sieve and the Sand, and we'll see why it's called that, because Montag has sort of a childhood recollection of trying to fill a sieve with sand on the beach, and we'll go into why that is. This is where we meet Faber. Faber is a English professor, very old, who hides out in his house and becomes sort of a mentor to Montag. We have a very um, kind of upsetting conclusion to this chapter. Some of his wife's friends come over and he reads a book to them, and it tears them apart. They don't know how to handle the emotions that the book is making them feel. The last chapter is called Burning Bright. In a way, this is sort of ironic because of what happens at the very beginning of that chapter. I won't spoil that for you, but it ends up becoming sort of a very hopeful thing that Montag himself kind of is burning bright. At the end of it, he will escape from kind of this world that he's been part of building, really. He will escape from being a fireman. He will escape and meet the book people, which are these are people much like Faber, intellectuals who have memorized all the great books. There's a reason why I shot this video in here, so I would have the Loeb Classical Library behind me. But these are the people who would have memorized Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides and the Marcus Aurelius and the Bible. They've memorized books of the Bible, and they are the people who are going to rebuild civilization. That once civilization has kind of destroyed itself. And another thing that's kind of happening in the backdrop this whole time is wars are going on, and this is a future where a war can be fought and won in just minutes because the world has nukes and nobody's afraid to use them. And whole cities, whole countries can be obliterated in seconds and victory declared as soon as war is declared almost. This is going to be something Bradbury, again, is very mindful of. This is something that dominates a lot of the fiction, of this period. Because remember that we're in the early, we're in the late 40s, early 50s. The Cold War is really beginning to ramp up. So think of all the dramas. And even some of the comedies that involve this kind of nuclear world that we live in now. This world we live in where there are superpowers with nuclear weapons that can just obliterate an entire population. Movie that comes to mind there, not just dramas but comedies. Think about Father Voidis and I watched a few weeks ago Dr. Strangelove, which is a very interesting, very very odd movie. But it's a comedy about the post-nuclear kind of world. So Burning Bright then takes on, there's kind of three layers to the meaning of that name. We'll go into that when we go into the deeper analysis of it, but one is, again, what happens at the beginning of the chapter, what happens kind of in the middle of the chapter, as he's fleeing and there's a war has started and ended, and then at the very end, I think, again, it strikes a hopeful note for us as to what will the future hold for Montag and these people he's encountering, who will then have to kind of help everything to rise from the ashes. So I think, and this is something I'll go into in kind of when we wrap everything up, but one of my theories about how to interpret the story is Montag is kind of a central figure. He's the mirror. And on either side of the mirror, there are diametrically opposed characters who each represent point and counterpoint of the same reality. So if Montag is the mirror in the middle, Faber is the good wise man on one side, who is mirrored by Fire Captain Beatty, who is who has a sort of different wisdom, a kind of perverse wisdom. So Beatty is a wise man, Faber is a wise man. We have a good wise man and a bad wise man. You have a happy woman in Clarice, who Montag meets early in the first chapter, and she is very instrumental in his kind of awakening. She is legitimately happy, genuinely happy. Then his wife Mildred is the mirror image of Clarice. She is a sort of happy person, that her happiness is all illusory. And we see that because the speeches that they will all give significant speeches, end up being the opposite of one another. Don't want to ruin too much of that right now, because this to me is kind of the most fascinating part of how this book is constructed. This is one of those books that as you read it, you become just so struck. Bradbury is a fantastic writer, and is just very good at his character psychology, very good at he's I would call him, this is going to sound sort of strange, but he's a very literary author. He's very good at kind of using the tradition that he comes from. He has a great reverence for sort of the literary tradition. But I would also say, too, he's just very good at using words. Slow down and pay attention to how he says things as he writes. One final little sidetrack, and then wrap this up for tonight. I was talking about Bradbury kind of being conscious of this sort of nuclear kind of era that the world is in. One of his short stories, another one I encountered in high school, another one I read as part of that academic competition, that we had the reading list for, and we had to answer questions about, is a story he wrote called "There Will Come Soft Rains." It is about an automated house in the future that continues to go about its routine even after the city that it's in is destroyed by a nuclear blast. So he's very good at these cautionary tales. Fahrenheit 451, I would say, is a very subtle cautionary tale about the death of the life of the mind. Things like There Will Come Soft Rains are a little less subtle, a little more on the nose about what's going to happen to the world if we keep lobbing nukes at each other, which thankfully we haven't been doing a lot of, and let's pray that we continue that. So, in any event, next week I will present kind of my close reading of the first chapter of Fahrenheit 451, The Hearth and the Salamander. We'll see how that goes in terms of length of content. If it ends up going a little bit long, I might break that into two talks just to give you some time to kind of read it and to let things sort of soak in a little bit. If there are questions, if there are comments, if there are corrections to be made, if there are snide remarks or bad jokes, please leave those in the comments, and I will probably bring those up at the beginning of the next talk. But thank you for joining me for this special edition of Father Cory's Book Club on one of my favorite books, Fahrenheit 451. God bless.